Beneath the Falling Snow, a story of betrayal, silence, and rebirth in the wake of a sister's ultimate betrayal and a lover's regret. The first snowfall of the year arrived quietly, drifting from the sky in hushed flurries, cloaking the world in an illusion of peace. Streets that had once echoed with footsteps and forgotten laughter now lay silent, their imperfections softened by a pure white veil. From where I stood, the window framed a landscape so still it seemed untouched by time, but within me a storm had already passed, one that had ripped through everything I once knew, leaving only silence in its wake. The house behind me was no longer a home. It had become a hollow shell, stripped of warmth and memory. The air carried no scent of morning coffee, no rhythm of familiar voices or laughter. There were no traces left of the life that had once existed here, just echoes that refused to fade. 1 year ago, everything changed. The night had crept in quietly, but what it brought was anything but gentle. He had returned later than usual, shoulders heavy with unspoken weight. And then, as if time itself recoiled, the truth emerged. A truth so cruel, it shattered the very foundation I stood upon. My sister, the one person whose presence had always meant safety, trust, and love. She was carrying his child. At first, my mind had refused to accept it. The pieces didn't align. This wasn't the sister who braided my hair, who protected me when I cried in the dark, who held my hand through every heartbreak. But betrayal has a cruel way of disguising itself until it's too late to look away. And when it was finally undeniable, the devastation was swift and merciless. For a long time, I existed in a blur. Days passed without feeling. Breathing became mechanical, and sleep came only when exhaustion claimed me. I would wake with a heaviness so consuming it felt like being buried beneath something invisible and unrelenting. Every memory that had once brought comfort now burned with shame and disbelief. Everyone thought I would leave. They waited for me to disappear, to vanish into some distant city where I could forget. But the idea of walking away felt too much like surrender. Leaving would have meant letting them write the ending. It would have meant allowing them to build a life on the ashes of mine. So I stayed. Not for him, not for her, not even for justice. I stayed to bear witness to their unraveling, their collapse, their slow and inevitable descent into the ruin they had created. They moved in together quickly, as if proximity could erase the guilt. Their new apartment was polished and curated, filled with soft tones and expensive accents meant to showcase a happy life. But there were cracks, even then. He no longer carried the lightness he once had, and she wore her victory like a crown made of glass, delicate and dangerous. From the outside, I played my part. I offered smiles when needed, sat through family gatherings without flinching, sent polite messages, and performed gestures of kindness. It was a mask I wore well. She never noticed how my words were measured, how my actions were intentional. She mistook civility for forgiveness. And over time, the illusion they had crafted began to splinter. He started to change. The confidence that once defined him faltered. His laughter grew scarce, and his gaze often drifted somewhere unreachable. Guilt had taken root in him, a slow corrosion that stripped away whatever joy he had hoped to find. As he withered, she clung tighter, her smiles becoming rigid, her words laced with desperation. What she thought she had stolen was slipping through her fingers. The child's birth was meant to renew their bond. But even that moment, fragile and sacred, became tainted. I sent a bouquet neutral in appearance, yet designed to stir unease. The note was subtle but pointed, its implications buried just deep enough to cause discomfort. It did what it was meant to do. Doubt began to spread like ink in water. He started questioning things he had once accepted. Conversations turned to silence. Arguments erupted over nothing. She cried more often, frustration blooming into paranoia, and he began to withdraw, his presence becoming shadow-like, restless, and detached. Their once pristine relationship, built on a lie, started to collapse under its own weight. The world they had tried to build was crumbling in slow motion. It was during one of those endless winter nights that the final fracture came. A call interrupted the quiet, and even before answering, I knew. His voice carried a tone I hadn't heard in a long time, a kind of desperation reserved for those who realize too late what they've lost. He had come to terms with his mistake, and the consequences he could no longer escape. But by then, I had changed. The version of me that had once needed him was gone, buried beneath the pain and rebirth of the past year. There was no vengeance in my heart, only clarity. Nothing he could say would rewrite the past. No apology could reconstruct what had been destroyed. I let the call end without resistance. There was nothing left for him to take. Now, standing here, the snow continues to fall, serene and undisturbed. From the outside, everything looks clean, renewed. But beneath that surface lies everything that was broken, buried but not forgotten. There's no satisfaction in what unfolded, only the quiet understanding that some wrongs echo longer than others. And while they may continue their lives fractured, strained, and incomplete, I have reclaimed mine, not through forgiveness, but through survival. The snow will melt, the silence will pass, The seasons will shift, and perhaps one day the pain will dull enough to feel distant. But for now, just for tonight, I allow the stillness to wrap around me, to soften the jagged edges of memory. Because sometimes, the only way to heal is to stand in the wreckage. Not to forget, but to remember every piece so that when the snow recedes, I will know exactly where I buried the past. Morning arrived with the faint sound of snow melting against the rooftops, the world outside shifting subtly from stillness to motion. Water traced slow paths down window panes, marking the glass like tears. The perfection of the night's snowfall had already begun to recede, revealing the imperfections it had so gently concealed. The illusion had passed, and what remained was the truth of everything broken. Life moved on, as it always did. The days grew longer, lighter, even as something in me remained untouched by the changing seasons. There was no dramatic transformation, no sweeping rebirth. Healing, I found, was quieter than expected. It was in the mundane moments of folding laundry, watering plants, and walking through the city without flinching at the sight of familiar places. Every small act became a thread, slowly reweaving the fabric of who I was. But memory is never truly linear. It returns in waves, often uninvited. There were mornings when I'd wake to the sound of laughter that no longer existed, moments when I'd reach for a hand that wasn't there. The past lingered like a ghost, not to haunt me, but to remind me of what I had endured. He tried again, reaching out in fragments through messages, through mutual acquaintances, and through silence stretched too thin. But I did not respond. Each attempt felt like an echo from a former life, and I had grown tired of echoes. Their relationship dissolved quietly. There was no dramatic collapse, no public announcement of separation. It ended the way it began, in secrecy and soft deception. She moved back into our childhood home with the baby, the lines beneath her eyes deeper than before. She no longer looked like someone who had won anything. Her triumph had long since soured into regret. I saw them once in the park, a brief glimpse. She pushed the stroller with slow, uncertain hands while the child looked up at the sky, fascinated by the falling petals of early spring. Her smile, when it came, was faint and brittle. I didn't approach. There was nothing left to confront. And yet, even with all the hurt she had caused, I didn't feel hatred. What I felt was something more complicated, something sadder. We had once been inseparable, bound not just by blood, but by belief. I had trusted her without hesitation, loved her with a loyalty that had no limits. Watching her now, I saw not a villain, but a woman trapped in the wreckage of her own choices. We were both victims of what had happened, just in different ways. In time, the whispers died down. Family members stopped speaking in careful tones around me. People no longer looked for signs of fracture beneath my smile. Life, it seemed, wanted to return to normal. But I had changed too deeply to return to what was. I found myself drawn to different places. The sea, especially, became a comfort. There was something about its vastness, its relentlessness, that mirrored my own quiet strength. I began taking weekend trips to the coast, walking along empty shorelines where no one knew my name, letting the wind strip away the remnants of everything I no longer needed to carry. In one small coastal town, I found a bookstore nestled between a cafe and an antique shop. It was quiet and dimly lit, the kind of place where time seemed to pause. I began spending hours there, surrounded by stories that had nothing to do with mine. The people who came and went didn't know who I had been or what I had survived. And in that anonymity, I found something like peace. Eventually, I started writing again. Not about the betrayal, not directly. But the words came, raw and steady, weaving fictional lives that mirrored my own unspoken truths. The characters I created bled so that I wouldn't have to. The stories became a bridge between who I was and who I was becoming. My own home changed too. I replaced the furniture, removed the photographs. I let go of the things that belonged to a past I no longer wished to preserve. The space became mine in a way it had never been before. Not a shrine to what was lost, but a sanctuary for what could still be found. I didn't erase him from memory. I didn't try to forget the years we had shared, but I stopped allowing those memories to dictate the rhythm of my days. They became chapters I no longer reread, only acknowledge. Time carried us all forward. I heard from a distant cousin that he had moved overseas, taking a job in a city I had once dreamed of visiting. Perhaps he thought distance could redeem him, or maybe he simply needed to vanish from the mess he'd made. Either way, his absence brought no sorrow. It was simply another shift in a story that had already ended. As for her, she continued. The child grew. I would see them occasionally at weddings and holidays where attendance was obligatory. She never spoke to me beyond politeness, and I never offered more than necessary. The silence between us was not cruel. It was mutual, necessary, and long overdue. There were moments, late at night, when I would lie awake and let the weight of it all settle over me. Not because I missed them, but because I understood them now in a way I hadn't before. People make choices. Sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of loneliness, sometimes because they believe they deserve more than they have. And sometimes, They hurt the people they love in the process. What they did to me wasn't right, it wasn't forgivable, but it no longer defined me. What remained after the storm wasn't vengeance or bitterness, it was clarity. It was solitude without loneliness. It was the quiet strength that comes from surviving something meant to break you. I stopped waiting for apologies. I stopped hoping for closure. The past had happened. It was real. And yet it no longer controlled me. It was simply a part of the landscape I had crossed to arrive here. As spring deepened into summer, I opened the windows more often, letting light flood the spaces that had once felt dark and confining. Flowers began to bloom along the edges of my small garden, wild and imperfect. I let them grow unruly. They reminded me of myself. There is something sacred in choosing to stay when everyone expects you to run. There is strength in standing in the ruins and rebuilding, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. By the time the next winter came, I no longer feared the snow. I welcomed it. I let it fall and coat the world in its fragile beauty, knowing that beneath it, nothing had been erased, only transformed. What they broke no longer needed mending. I had built something new in its place.